a more modest program was proposed, and that over the next 12 years, the Polish Navy would plan an upgrade of 2 cruisers, 6 destroyers, 12 torpedo boats, and a similar number of submarines. But in the end, it also turned out to be unfeasible at the time for the same financial constraints. So, what kind of warships did the Polish fleet have at the start of the war? Well, the Poles had ordered their first large ships from France, which was at the time their main policy partner, and they built their navy around Borask-class destroyers. 2 ships, Richer and Burza, entered service in 1930 and 1932 respectively. Following the plans for the smaller program of 1924, 3 Wilk-class mine layers were ordered. Then, in the early 1930s, a campaign was launched to raise funds amongst the population for the construction of a large submarine. By mid-1935, the necessary amount had been raised. By this time, the budget had allocated funds for the construction of a second submarine as well. Ordered in the Netherlands, they were christened Orzel and Simp. However, Poland was no real match for its neighbours, the Soviet Union and Germany, in terms of number of ships laid down, so they had instead to get the edge in terms of performance, and they did this by placing an order for fleet destroyers in the UK. The White shipyard delivered splendidly. In 1937, 2 ships, Byskovitza and Grom, turned out to be the best European destroyers of the time pretty much. The following year, in 1938, a Grief-type mine layer was put into service. This was an unconventional ship built in France, and in addition to its main designation, it was also intended to serve as a training ship and as the presidential yacht. Since the Baltic Sea is a very suitable theatre for mine warfare, appropriate ships were needed. 6 units of this class were commissioned, becoming the largest class in the Polish fleet, and they were deemed successful in performing their role. The minesweeper classes got a designation from the name of the first ship of its kind, Jaskolka. Czajka, Mewa, and others followed. But their main disadvantage was that they could only perform in coastal waters. By the outbreak of World War II, the Polish Navy consisted of 5 submarines, 4 destroyers, 1 big mine layer, and various smaller support vessels and mine warfare ships. This force was no match for the larger Kriegsmarine, with their battleships, pocket battleships, and more than 50 U-boats. If, until the autumn of 1938, the government of the Polish Republic was thinking the USSR to be its main adversary, in October the situation changed. Germany aggressively demanded that Poland join the Anti-Comintern Pact and surrender the free city of Danzig. The proposals were deemed completely unacceptable, and the general headquarters of the Polish army started drafting a westward-facing posture in case of German aggression. Starting from March 1939, the Polish fleet was on high alert, but the Naval Command was aware that if a war broke out, their surface ships would be quickly destroyed by enemy aircraft since their air defenses were considered weak. In such a situation, there are basically 2 choices. One is to die heroically in an uneven battle, and the other is to withdraw the modern Polish destroyers from the Baltic Sea and escape to Great Britain, thus enabling them to continue the fight. After long and heated disputes, the latter option was chosen in what was called Operation Peking. The breakthrough group included the destroyers Burza, Byskovitza, and Grom. On August 29, 1939, mobilization was announced in Poland, and the next day the commanders of the 3 destroyers in the breakout group received their orders to evacuate to the UK. The ships sounded their battle alarms, and in the middle of the day, they left the Oskiewa naval base in Gdansk Bay. Their ultimate destination wasn't disclosed even to the crew. First, they took a course heading to Swedish shores, but then the group turned northwest. However, German submarines were already waiting for them out at sea. Officially, the war had not yet been declared, but the submarine commanders already had orders to torpedo any Polish ships heading towards Sweden or Denmark. Fortunately, the Poles managed to dodge them and got away from also the German cruiser Königsberg and the destroyers sent in pursuit. The Germans simply could not keep up with the Polish ships. After the 3 Polish destroyers entered the Danish Straits, the enemy ships turned around and headed south. This would prove to be an important moment for Poland, but more on that later. In the middle of August 31, the last peaceful day of 1939, the Polish task force was spotted again by German reconnaissance aircraft, which were already in the North Sea. In order to mislead the enemy, the Poles turned towards Norway, so the reports in Germany read that the destroyers were moving in that direction. As night fell, the Polish ships managed to shake off their fellow travellers and turned towards British shores. On September the 1st, after their homeland had already entered into war with Hitler, the Polish sailors approached Scottish shores, where they were met by His Majesty's destroyers, and the rescue operation was completed. Early in the morning of September the 1st, a roar from Danzig could be heard on the naval base of Oskiva. The Germans had started their assault on Westerplatte. Soon reports started coming in about German air raids on the naval base in Hell, 1L, and on the fleet aviation base in Puck. During these raids, Captain 2nd Rank Edward Chatowski died, becoming the first naval officer to fall in the line of duty in World War II. The first raid on Oskiva was conducted by German seaplanes. Falling behind submarine Wilk, fleet destroyer Witcher and minesweeper Mewa opened fire at them, but no aircraft were shot down. Next came 32 German dive bombers, and their impact was terrible. The bombs fell on the port, the air defense battery, and ammunition depots. German aircraft quickly sank a training artillery ship, a diving tender, and a tug, resulting in more than 50 casualties. In the middle of the day, just before the second raid, all of the Polish ships took to the sea under Operation Rurka. The plan was to lay a naval mine barrier between Hel Peninsula and Danzig, thus preventing any enemy ship from entering the area. The lead ship was the Grief mine layer. Her mission was to take mines from barges and then go to Puck Bay. All the minesweepers, 2 gunboats, and the last destroyer remaining in Polish waters, Witcher, were to provide escort. Furthermore, it was simply too dangerous to remain in the port, as the Poles had already felt the power of German air raids, and at least at sea they could take evasive action. The operation was scheduled for 10 p.m. By that time, the ships were supposed to rendezvous near the port of Hel, and until then they were cruising at sea, which did not escape the attention of German air reconnaissance. Soon, another 40 Luftwaffe aircraft took off with their bombers escorted by cover fighters. Many of the pilots had fought in Spain in the Civil War, and they'd perfected their combat techniques there. Now they had the opportunity to put this into practice. The Polish ships would become the first to get a taste of Hermann Göring's dive bombers. The aircraft were flying threes, approaching from bow or stern. 2 were to sweep the ship with machine gun fire, and 1 to dive and drop bombs. The ships put up a dense barrage of AA fire, but they were no match for the high-speed dive bombers. All hell broke loose. First, a water and smoke jet shot up nearby, and then suddenly 2 bombs were dropped next to Mewa. The first exploded at the port side of the bow. A fire started, and the forward gun crew was wiped out. The second bomb, breaking the left beam, fell into the water, and it exploded near the bridge, injuring all of those on the bridge, as well as machine gun men and radio operators. After the battle, parts of human bodies and debris covered the upper deck, and everything was covered with blood. The ship looked terrible, as if it had returned from the underworld. This was how one of the minesweeper's sailors recalled the battle. The results were grim. 2 minesweepers had jammed rudders, and Mewa's commander was badly injured. The crew had 9 men killed and 8 wounded, including the first mate. Grief took similar damage, and the telegraph, the compass, and the radio stations were disabled. 5 sailors were killed, and 21 were wounded by bullets and splinters, and Grief's commander died from his wounds. Operation Rurka had to be called off, and Grief's executive officer assumed command. Fearing that her cargo of 300 mines was a bit of a liability, he ordered the munitions to be thrown overboard. The damaged mine layer arrived at the port of Hel, where Mewa and Richer also arrived after receiving the order to abort on the morning of September 2nd. The remaining minesweepers, 3 of them, Chaika, Chapla, and Ribitra, relocated to a nearby base in Yastran. Events unfolded rapidly. In the afternoon, Grief and Richer engaged 2 German destroyers, which were trying to break into the port, managing to stop the enemy and forcing them to retire. The accurate gunfire of the Poles damaged one of the German ships, Z-1 destroyer Lebrecht Maas, and killed 4 of her crew. The Germans were somewhat displeased, and the next day, on the 3rd of September, the Luftwaffe made a new raid, on the port of Hell. This time the dive bombers did their job and both Polish ships were sunk. As the fleet destroyer Witcher was sinking, it generated a wave that impacted the hull of the damaged minesweeper Mira and sent it to the bottom in the harbour. After that, the only combat-capable ships remaining in Polish waters were the Jaskolka-class minesweepers. The commander of Jaskolka said that their crew felt that they were part amphibian. Every night they would dismount the machine guns and mount them around the port, only to bring them back to the ship again at dawn. Despite this, the morale of the crew was quite high, despite the unfortunate news coming from the battlefront. After the first engagement at sea with enemy aircraft, the Poles adjusted. They learned from their minor combat experience that bombs could be dodged if the ship started maneuvering at the time of release. Jaskolka even managed to bring down one of the Junkers aircraft during one of the sorties. The biggest danger for the sailors was the machine gun fire from German aircraft. There was no way to dodge it, and the ships weren't armoured. Over the next 10 days, from the 4th to the 14th of September, the minesweepers laid mines once and fired at German land positions twice. The ships fired the 75mm guns from a distance of 3,500 to 4,000 metres, and their direct fire was accurate. The enemy positions were rather shell-ridden. The Germans did not expect an attack from the sea, and the Polish had caught them by surprise. But September the 14th was the last success story for the Polish minesweepers. Almost immediately after returning to Jastran, at about 10 a.m., the Polish ships were attacked by German aircraft, and the result was devastating. Jaskolka was hit behind the superstructure and a major fire started, which resulted in the ammunition stores exploding. Let's turn once again to the memory of some of the crewmen. A terrible roar came from the sky again and again. The planes bombed everything around and fired their heavy machine guns. Explosions, fire, smoke, the earth is shaking. I want to crawl under the ground. A huge pillar of fire is rising above Jaskolka. She got hit. I cannot stand it and close my eyes, and when I open them, as if through a haze, I see Jaskolka slowly sinking. Several bombs hit another minesweeper, Chapla, almost breaking the hull in two and sinking the ship. The third minesweeper, Rebitva, received a direct hit aft from a small bomb and was badly damaged. The sunken ships were stripped of most of their equipment, and the crews went ashore to form marine infantry units. The surviving Chaika, Jurawa, and Rebitva, whose deck and hull were now patched up with plywood, were relocated to Hell. These ships stayed there until the Polish garrison surrendered. On October the 2nd, the seacocks were opened and the vessels were scuttled. Now let's have a look at what was happening to the submarine fleet of the Polish Republic in these early days of the war. Polish command decided to take a defensive course of action. All of the submarines of the Polish fleet were deployed off the coast of Hel Peninsula. When it became clear that Poland was about to fall, 3 of the 5 submarines, 2 underwater mine layers and the large submarine Semp, went to the Swedish coast in the second half of September, where they were then interned. They were eventually returned to the Polish after the war ended. Of particular note are the fates of the main mine layer Wilk and the second large submarine, Orzo. Let's start with Wilk. The underwater mine layer Wilk was the first to open fire at the enemy seaplanes trying to conduct reconnaissance in Gdansk Bay in the early morning hours of September the 1st. She deployed her mines as planned around Hel and at the mouth of Gdansk Bay, and also attempted to attack several times enemy ships. The attacks were unsuccessful as she was under continuous depth charge attacks and had to lay on the sea bottom during the daytime. She suffered minor damage. On the night of September the 10th, the main engine failed and was repaired only with great difficulty. In addition, minor damage caused by the depth charges had led to an oil leak. Receiving a radiogram from Wilk reporting the situation, command ordered her to break through the Denmark Strait and head for Great Britain. Repair and refueling in Hel was no longer possible, but the submarine had enough range to make the British coast. After the officers' meeting, the captain decided to give it a go. In the Bay of Mecklenburg, Wilk encountered heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and was preparing to attack her, but the cruiser then turned and started pulling away. Pursuit was impossible as the maps indicated shallow waters ahead. Early in the morning of September the 14th, near the city of Trelleborg, the boat went down and remained underwater for more than 15 hours, and then entered the Flint Ring Canal in the evening. Here is the recollection of the first mate. The night is dark, and we proceeded under a full blackout. The crew manned the gun and the machine guns. The channel is narrow and shallow, with no room port or starboard. Halfway in, we noticed the running lights of two ships taking an opposite course, German destroyers. We steered port side a little to avoid collision, missing them by some 60 meters. One of the ships directed her spotlight at us. Tension is high, we are ready to open fire, although we understand that this would be the end for the submarine. But the enemy is leaving. As it turned out later, they were German destroyers Z4 Richard Beitzen and T-107, and had mistaken us for a Swedish vessel in the dark. On September 15th, the submarine commander sent a radiogram about their successful crossing of the straits. We have passed Zund and missed 2 destroyers. Proceeding to England, long live Poland. A British destroyer was sent to rendezvous with Wilk and escort her to the Rosyth naval base. An even more dramatic and fascinating story is that of the submarine Orgel. During the enemy's first air raid on September the 1st at Oskiva, the submarine wasn't damaged and after 2 hours headed out to sea. The first couple of days of patrolling went smoothly. In the afternoon, the boat would hide from the German aviation deep underwater, occasionally ascending to periscope depth to have a look around. And at night, she'd be charging the batteries on the surface. But on the 4th, when she surfaced to periscope depth, Orgel was suddenly attacked by a German bomber. Depth charges damaged the compressor and disabled the evaporator, but the sub still managed to go deep. Then Orgel changed her area of operations, but failed to spot any enemy ships. On September the 10th, Orgel sent a message to headquarters about the commander coming down with what was suspected to be typhoid. In the response radiogram, command suggested that they return to base or go to a neutral port and leave the commander there, with the first mate assuming command. The commander made a strange choice. On the evening of September the 14th, Orgel arrived in Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, although the government of that country openly sympathized with Germany at the time. In the port of Tallinn, the equipment damaged by the raid on September the 4th was removed from the boat and sent for repair, and the commander was sent to hospital. Chief Officer Jan Grudzinski assumed command and immediately found himself in a very difficult situation. At the insistence of Germany, the Estonian military authorities boarded the ship, interned the crew, confiscated all the navigation aids and maps, and commenced removing all of her armament. This was completely contrary to international law, but it was one of those offers you just can't refuse. An Estonian gunboat was anchored next to the Polish submarine with the guns trained on the poles. The crew of Orgel conspired together to carry out a daring escape. They all had their own part in their escape plan. The boatswain took a small boat around the harbour and under the guise of fishing, but he was actually covertly measuring the depth of the planned escape route, while others studied the position of coastal batteries and the location of spotlights as they were just walking around the port. The Poles would build a rapport with the Estonian guards and learn the routine from local dockers in order to determine the best time to escape. They paid special attention to the location of power cables. Grudzinski's sabotage of the torpedo hoist on 16th of September prevented the Estonians from removing the 6 aft torpedoes. It also turned out that diesel engines could only be dismantled after they had been cleaned, and the radio had to be repaired prior to disassembly. At around midnight on September the 18th, the port lights suffered an unexplained malfunction. Seizing the opportunity, Grudzinski prepared the submarine for departure. The crew was forced to delay due to the arrival of an Estonian officer. After a 30-minute inspection, he deemed nothing to be out of the ordinary and bid the Poles good night. The crew then resumed their plans. 2 Estonian guards at the dock were lured aboard and taken prisoner without any violence. The lighting in the port was, of course, intentionally sabotaged, and the mooring lines were cut with an axe. Both engines were started, and the submarine made her escape under the cover of darkness. Estonians tried to stop the submarine with a machine gun and artillery fire from the berths and the gunboat, but in vain. the boat was able to escape undamaged and submerge. Later, they learned from the British radio intercepts that Estonian and government press covering the incident claimed that the 2 captured guards had been murdered by the Polish crewmen. In reality, they were deposited off of the Swedish coast in a rubber dinghy and provided with clothing, food, and money for their safe return home. Lieutenant Grudzinski intended to seize the maps of a German vessel, as all of Orgel's navigational aids, with the exception of a guide of Swedish lighthouses, had been confiscated. No German merchantmen were ever spotted, however. After 3 weeks of searching, it was decided to leave the Baltic and head for Britain, once the sailors had learned that the war for Poland was coming to an end. It took 2 days to pass through the heavily guarded entrance. The only references that the Poles had were the lighthouse guide and a rudimentary map drawn by the navigation officer. On the night of October the 7th, the submarine started to make its escape through the Zund Strait. The crew manned all positions, and the commander decided that if it seemed likely that Orgel was going to be captured, she should be scuttled and the crew should save their own lives. During the night, the sub got stranded, but she was later able to break free. Then she was nearly spotted by a sentry ship, but she managed yet to make her escape. The next day, she stayed on the bottom and covered the last strip of Zund and found herself in Kattegat. The rest, well, that was a piece of cake. The submarine headed through the North Sea and made landfall off Scotland on the 14th of October. The crew sent out a signal in broken English, and a British destroyer came out and escorted them into the port. Orgel's arrival came as a bit of a surprise to the British Admiralty. They had long considered the submarine lost. Coming to serve under British command was an important political decision. Having saved the crews and the flags, the Polish ships were the only remnants of Polish territory not occupied by foreign powers. The Poles were hell-bent on getting back into the fight, when British command suggested that perhaps the crew of Orgel deserved a rest. Captain Jan Grudzinski declared, "We want to fight. We'll get our rest after the war." In the late fall of 1939, the Polish destroyers that had arrived in England took part in what was known as the campaigns of the Polish fleet under British command, and Orgel received her first combat mission on December the 29th to escort the ON-6 convoy from England to the Norwegian port of Bergen. The Polish fight against the Germans continued.
Oh, aircraft carrier done in that one.
force
We
detected.
just gave them C.
Enemy battleship sighted. Enemy destroyer detected.
All stations requesting fire on the designated target.
Torpedo support. Enemy battleship detected. Torpedoes to port. Enemy destroyer detected.
All stations concentrate fire on the
Torpedoes, dead ahead.
All forces, capture that area. Concentrate fire on the designated target.
nice tits.
Action stations.
front.
Enemy destroyer detected. Enemy battleship sighted.
You gone.
sight.
Problem solved, sir.
Our victory is in sight.
I guess they're back. Oh, that's back. Yay. Damn it, I didn't mean to do that. Oops. Hello. Anybody home? big suck. Right? Right, my suck? You boys suck. Let me scratch your chin. Let me scratch your chin. God almighty. You and that tongue. Fuck off.
Problem solved, sir.
Enemy destroyer detected.
Extraction stations.
Enemy cruiser sighted.
Get back! Get back! Get back!
Enemy cruiser detected. Enemy battleship sighted. Enemy cruiser sighted. Enemy battleship sighted.
Enemy severely damaged.
Enemy cruiser sighted.
Enemy cruiser sunk.
Enemy aircraft carrier sighted.
What's she doing?
Enemy battleship detected.
Enemy aircraft carrier destroyed.
Our team has taken the lead.
General quarters.
Autopilot mode enabled.